Let's get one thing clear from the start. Medieval castles were not cozy fairy tale homes. They were freezing. Not grab a blanket and you're fine. Cold, but the kind of cold where you could see your breath indoors. Imagine stepping into a giant stone box that cared more about surviving a siege than about keeping its residents comfortable. No central heating, no radiators, not even the luxury of glass windows to block the wind. So here's the hook. How did people survive the night without turning into human icicles? When we think of castles today, we often picture candlelight glowing on tapestries, nobles wrapped in fur robes, and roaring fires in the hearth. But the reality, most nights were brutally uncomfortable. Behind those thick walls was a world colder than the forests outside. No insulation, no double glazing, just raw stone, open spaces, and icy winds creeping through every crack. Sleeping in a castle was not romantic. It was a nightly battle, and in winter, this battle could be as deadly as any army outside the walls. Let's start with the enemy itself. Stone. Castles were built from it for good reasons. Stone doesn't burn. It resists arrows and battering rams. It lasts for centuries, but there's one problem. Stone is a terrible insulator. It soaks up cold like a sponge, and once it's cold, it stays that way for days. Even if you lit a fire, the heat would vanish the moment the flames died out. Now picture this: 10-foot thick walls towering around you, high ceilings where warm air escaped, and tiny windows, if you had any at all. No carpets, no insulation, just echoing stone radiating the chill of the earth itself. At night, when the fires dimmed, the cold became a silent invader, unseen, unstoppable, and absolutely everywhere. So the big question remains: how did medieval people endure this kind of cold? That's where our journey begins. We uncovered the first enemy: cold stone walls. But the truth is, it wasn't just the material. It was the very design of castles that trapped people in endless winter. Think about it. Medieval castles weren't built for comfort. They were fortresses. Everything about their architecture screamed survival: high towers, wide halls, long drafty corridors. These features were perfect for spotting enemies or moving troops, but they created a nightmare for anyone trying to stay warm. Here's the cruel irony: the thicker the walls, the colder the rooms felt. Those massive 10-foot slabs of stone locked in winter's chill like a giant freezer. Even when you lit a fire in the hearth, most of the warmth rushed upward and disappeared into the rafters. Down on the floor, where people lived and slept, the air remained bitter and raw. And fireplaces. They weren't the glowing sources of comfort we imagine today. A single fireplace could never heat a whole chamber, let alone a castle. Most of the heat shot straight up the chimney, and what stayed behind barely reached beyond arm's length. Sit close, and you roasted on one side while your back froze. Move just a few steps away, and you were shivering again. So, did people just give up? Not exactly. They fought the cold with every trick they had. Heavy wooden doors were covered with wool or leather to block drafts. Narrow spiral staircases trapped warmer air on the lower levels, and tapestries, those beautiful wall hangings we admire in museums, were not just decoration. They were insulation, a desperate attempt to stop icy air from crawling down the walls. But here's the hook. Even with all these tricks, the cold still won. Every night, noble or servant, lord or soldier, had to face the same unrelenting chill. Which raises the next question: what did they actually do to keep themselves warm enough to survive? And that brings us to the most human part of the story. So, how did they fight back against the cold? The answer: with fire, fabric, and a lot of creativity. The first weapon was fire. Great halls had huge hearths, while bedrooms used smaller fireplaces. But heat didn't spread far, so people carried braziers filled with glowing coals, like a portable sun in their hands. The second fortress was the bed. It wasn't just a mattress, it was survival. Heavy curtains trapped body heat inside, and nobles piled on blankets of wool and fur. Servants, meanwhile, often had little more than rough cloth. There were also clever tricks. Bed warmers, metal pans filled with embers, slid under the sheets. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were tucked at the feet. Even simple flasks of hot water existed in primitive form. And warmth wasn't just physical, it was communal. Servants slept huddled together, sometimes even beside animals in the stables. The wealthy had furs and feather beds, but still, the night was never truly warm. One thing was certain: in a castle, bedtime wasn't just rest, it was a fight for survival. And that leaves us with a bigger question. If even nobles struggled, what was life like for the servants who lived in the cold every day? Not everyone in a castle faced the cold the same way. For the nobility, winter meant heavy curtains, fur-lined blankets, and servants who warmed their chambers before bed. Lords and ladies had private rooms, great beds, and braziers carried in just for them. Yet even with all that, the chill still seeped through stone and velvet. For them, it was discomfort. For others, it was survival. Servants lived a much harsher reality. They slept in crowded halls on straw mattresses, with little more than thin cloth for warmth. Fireplaces were rare, and the only real heat came from huddling together, or from animals in the stables. If your spot was near a drafty wall, the cold was merciless. But here's the twist. Sometimes the poor had an advantage. Packed tightly together, their shared body heat kept them warmer than a noble alone in a vast, freezing chamber. A lord had silk sheets, but a servant had human warmth. And in winter, that made all the difference. Still, the divide was clear. Nobles could summon embers for their hearth at dawn, while servants woke stiff and shivering, expected to work immediately. The castle's hierarchy wasn't just about wealth or status. It reached down to the very struggle for warmth. And it leaves us with a question. If cold touched every life in the castle, how did it shape the way people lived, worked, and even thought within those frozen walls? Throughout this journey, we've seen how cold ruled every corner of the medieval castle. But the real story is this. Cold didn't just shape the way people slept or fought through the night. It shaped their entire way of life. Think of daily routines. The Great Hall wasn't just a place to eat and celebrate. It was the warmest shared space, so life revolved around it. People gathered close to the hearth not only for food, but for survival. Even politics, conversations, and entertainment happened near the fire. Heat was power, and whoever controlled the hearth controlled the room. The architecture itself tells the same story. Narrow windows, thick walls, heavy tapestries, all designed to keep in whatever warmth they could. Clothes were layered endlessly: linen, wool, fur, leather. The fashion of the time wasn't only about style, it was a battle uniform against the chill. And beyond the walls, cold shaped culture and imagination. Tales of frost, spirits, and winter hardships filled medieval folklore. Songs and stories often reflected the constant fight against nature, where warmth became a symbol of safety, wealth, even love. Here's the truth. Castles were mighty, but they were never comfortable. Stone made them strong, but it also made them prisons of ice. For nobles and servants alike, life was a delicate balance between survival and status, warmth and power. And maybe that's the final lesson when we imagine the romance of medieval castles. We see banquets, battles, and beauty. But behind every scene was the unshakable presence of cold, an invisible enemy, shaping lives as much as kings or wars ever did. So the next time you step into a castle and feel the chill creeping through the walls, remember, that's not just the past whispering, that is history itself.